and specifically the Chicago area. And so the way we're going to do this is we'll have Lisa will start us off, and then I will follow up, and then taking up the rear and bringing us home will be Jason. So, Lisa?
Yeah. Thank you so much. My name is Lisa Doi. I am the president of the Chicago chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League. But I am largely presenting some work I did as a graduate student at the University of Chicago looking at residential patterns of Japanese Americans over a few decades immediately after World War II. I am going to provide some more historical context to the Japanese American experience in Chicago. But I think each of us is going to sort of move back and forth in time in terms of grounding this story in the history of Japanese American community in Chicago, and then also what that community looks like today, because I think between the three of us, we capture a range of existing community organizations and community activism within Chicago. So let's see if I can make this work. All right. I wanted to just start, even before we get to Chicago, with right after I graduated college, I taught high school history. And so as a history teacher, I think it would be important for me to say that I want to frame any moment in history, but including Japanese American incarceration, as a series of choices made by people that had real life consequences. And I think something that's always fascinated me is that period between December 7th and February 19th, when Executive Order 9066 was signed. And I think it's important for me to remember that mass confinement was not the inevitable outcome of bombing Pearl Harbor, and in fact, didn't even emerge in sort of documents between people in the Roosevelt administration until very late in that late January, early February time period. So I always sort of wondered how this choice of mass confinement came about, and then once that happened, what was next? And I think when you look at the WRA's records, it's very clear that the WRA does not want to have to permanently house Japanese Americans. And so instead, they looked to this program of dispersal resettlement, of taking Japanese Americans from confinement sites and encouraging people to disperse across the United States. And in order for this to be sort of the outcome, I wanted to sort of reframe the cause a little bit of why some members of the Roosevelt administration even considered mass confinement. And so I have this quote from Eleanor Roosevelt about pre-war ethnic enclaves. And so what she points to are these communities, these high-density Japanese American communities along the West Coast, Japantowns and Little Tokyos, that were really self-sufficient and really insulated. And to her, that's sort of the reason that you developed this ethnic, this race-based prejudice that then can cause mass confinement. And sort of keeping in line with some of the other New Deal era policies, then this offers the opportunity to develop a government-facilitated assimilation plan. So if the problem is that Japanese Americans are living in communities that are too dense before the war, the solution is the US government, should help disperse people across the country. And so I think that's really how I come to understand then the consequence of having this program of dispersal resettlement and this community of Japanese Americans that forms in Chicago. So that's sort of, then Dylan Meyer, who's the head of the WRA, develops this program of leave clearance. That's where you get the loyalty questionnaire that determines who's eligible for permanent leave. And then you get this program of dispersing people in other parts of the country. At one point, Franklin Roosevelt said his ideal distribution of Japanese Americans would be one family in every community across the United States. Fortunately, that did not happen. And even though this is sort of the ideal, in practice, it kind of had more mixed results, where ultimately, Japanese Americans left camp, made new lives, and then encouraged their friends and relatives to come join them. And so you do see sort of clear patterns of migration from particular camps to different communities across the country. And Chicago, I think it's important to say, was the largest resettlement community outside of the West Coast. So, before 1945, before the West Coast reopened, Chicago was the largest community of Japanese Americans in the country. And then even when the West Coast did reopen, it remained the largest community of Japanese Americans outside of the West Coast. So this is just a final goodbye letter from Dylan Meyer that you received when you were leaving, describing his wishes for really this dream of assimilating into a very white imagination of what America would be. This is from a report from the WRA in 1946, where a WRA researcher, this is a map of Chicago, and the researcher drew in red where Japanese Americans live around Chicago. And I think one of the first tensions that arises is there was this dream of assimilating Japanese Americans and having them live in really dispersed communities across the country. But in reality, there was still a lot of racial prejudice, even outside of the West Coast. There was a lot of discrimination that Japanese Americans faced in housing. And there was just, there was community, there were families. People weren't going to really live alone as these pioneers in communities all across the country. People wanted to congregate. And so you see this very clearly in Chicago, where there are some pretty high density areas of Japanese American residential congregation around the city. And even in this report in 1946, the WRA names these communities as Japantowns. So the WRA is recognizing that in spite of their dreams of assimilating people, that communities are forming, communities are building that are both residential and commercial. So then I'm going to kind of quickly jump through a series of maps showing residential patterns over time of Japanese Americans that are drawn from community directories, so telephone books. So there was a group called the Californians, they spelled it with a K, that made these telephone books that helped Japanese Americans find each other when they moved to Chicago and sort of stay connected. People could opt into them, and it was also drawn from the membership lists of churches and temples and boys clubs and basketball leagues and bowling clubs and stuff like that. So they tried to get a wide swath of the Japanese American community. And the other thing I wanted to do was put these maps in conversation with other racial housing patterns within the city of Chicago. So I'm going to cycle through a series of maps that look like this, and then a series you'll see in a second. So here, again, city of Chicago. The purpler the section is, or the darker blue the section is, that's parts of Chicago that are very white, and then parts that are red are parts of Chicago that are black. We won't get to a point where you really see other racial groups in Chicago. So when Japanese Americans come to Chicago in around 1943, they're coming to a city that's very black and white. And the pre-war Japanese American community was about somewhere between 200 to 400 people. So very small. So it goes from about 200 to 400 people in 1940 to about 20,000 by 1945. So it's a very big jump. Wrong way. All right. So when Japanese Americans first arrived, this is sort of where they're living. In a community on the south side of Chicago around Hyde Park, around the University of Chicago's campus. That's that bottom section. And then a community on the near north side, centered around an intersection called Clark and Division. And then when you overlay these maps on top of each other, you'll see that this is the south side community, this is the north side community, but the south side community in particular really lives along this dividing line between historically black communities and white communities. And over the course of the very late 40s, this Cottage Grove, which is that street that divides those two neighborhoods, begins to break down as a racial barrier. So by 1950, you start to see the black community expanding beyond some of the really restrictive racial covenants that existed in the 40s. And so some of the areas on the south side and some of the areas on the near north side are actually becoming more racially mixed. And again, you'll see, wrong way. And again, you'll see that these are really the areas that Japanese Americans are living in. Those spaces sort of in between black and white Chicago. So by the time we get to the 1960s, this is really broken down, and African Americans are really able to move into a lot more communities around the south and west sides of Chicago. And sort of as you look at this, the population of Japanese Americans on the south side has really diminished. So right after the war ended, there was this high density community on the south side and a little bit sort of on the north side. But now the community on the south side is almost gone, and the community on the north side has moved farther and farther north. So by the time you reach the 1960s, which is when this information is coming from, the black communities on the south side, there are very few Japanese Americans, and Japanese Americans started around here and have moved just increasingly north, and not just north within the city of Chicago, but also north to the suburbs. And then just one final map of the 1970s, where I think this is just even clearer that Japanese Americans are moving further and further north. And actually Jason's grandfather was one of the first families that integrated suburban communities, and it was a really challenging experience for Japanese American families, both from racial violence that they experienced moving to the suburbs, and the choice of leaving these, what were once called Little Tokyos in Chicago, and sort of this imagination of sort of a suburban 1960s American dream. And I think that this is a really fascinating question. And I think it's a really fascinating question for what were the implications for the community in Chicago that then could continue to exist, and the community in Chicago that I was lucky enough to be able to grow up in. And I think, let's see what's next. Well, we'll get there in a second. So I think, you know, in relocation Arkansas, I think one of the questions that was really salient to me was a question about what does resistance look like. And Paul had talked about sort of his frustration and not being able to see that in his parents' experience. And I think if you bring that back to Duncan's talk last night, and the concept of even building a Japanese American community in Chicago, to me this is a deeply political act. To say that we're going to build a Buddhist temple, not just one Buddhist temple, we're going to build 2 Buddhist temples in Chicago, that we're going to start bowling leagues, that we're going to start basketball leagues, that there are going to be a whole slew of Japanese American Christian churches where we're going to congregate together, and we're going to teach our children how to have obon, and we're going to teach our children how to have New Year's. That to me, when the purpose of this dispersal resettlement is to assimilate Japanese Americans, when that was seen as the goal by the WRA, that even building these kinds of institutions, building the Chicago Resettlers Committee, starting a JCL chapter, to me that is a very political action. That is an action of resistance. And so I think I'm also really lucky to have grown up, well, one, with the parents I had who really pushed me to be part of the Japanese American community, but also at a really special time, I think, for the Japanese American community in Chicago, where particularly the JSCL at that time was building programs for people my age to help sort of bring in this new generation of Yonsei, to understanding our history, to building identity, and to building community. So I just wanted to highlight 2 things really quickly before I hand it off. So one of our sort of signature programs of JSL Chicago is called the Kansha Project, and it's a program specifically for Japanese Americans from Chicago or the Midwest, recognizing that growing up sort of not on the West Coast is a slightly different experience of identity formation and community building. And it's a free trip to LA and to Manzanar. And that's sort of initially how we had to pitch it, as a free trip. But I think over the years it's really gained a following and a community of its own, of alumni who actually now run the program and who make it possible. And I think it is helping in just a small way to really build community and build identity amongst younger Japanese Americans. And we're actually really lucky this year that we have a little bit of grant funding to be able to do a program like this for high school students. So this is a program for college-age students. So we actually have a little bit of money to do a program for high school students, young Japanese Americans, as well as young Arab Americans from Chicago. And we're going to drive all the way back down here And we're gonna go spend some time in Little Rock this summer, and then we're gonna spend some time in Rohwer. It's a 15-hour drive because we have a 15-passenger van. We will see how it goes. And so I think like just having the opportunity to have communities like this and to build identity in this way is how I see the lingering vestiges of this question of whether or not assimilation in Chicago was successful. So I think I'm handing it off to you.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay. Okay, so I'm Mike Takata, and as you heard, I am the CEO of the Chicago Japanese American Service Committee, and our predecessor is the Chicago Resettlers Committee. And the Resettlers Committee was formed in 1946, and what I'd like to do is just give you some more information about the efforts of many brave people and all the help that they had received in actually making this happen. I wanted to start this off with a quote that actually is off of the intro of my daughter's undergraduate thesis. She went to NYU, graduated in 2014, and her thesis was actually on the Chicago Resettlers Committee. And this is from Brian Comey Dempster, his book, Making Home from War. If the drama of incarceration was an earthquake, concentrated and overt, marked by the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and characterized by the camp strung with barbed wire and towers full of armed guards, then the drama of resettlement was the aftershock, drawn out and insidious, signified by abandoned barracks and irretrievable homes, blisters and sore muscles from picking fruit and washing dishes, insults and stares from suspicious bosses and neighbors, and the grating claustrophobia of being packed together in ramshackle living conditions. And for me personally, I'm the son of a Nisei out of Los Angeles who was incarcerated in Amachi, and the son of a mom who spent the war in Japan and didn't come to the States till after the war. It is, you know, every time I come to programs such as this, and the more that I work in this space, I've been at the organization now in a leadership position for 5 years. It's just mind-boggling, and I keep hearing this as to, you know, how insidious this experience was and continues to be, right? I mean, as a sensei, it clicks on so many different things and so many different levels about how I was raised, the filters that I've had as a kid, how the filters that I've had through life as an adult, and you know, I think this group definitely sees that. So these are, you know, just some imageries of you know, what camp life, or what life potentially after the camp was going to look like, and we've heard different stories. So in 1946, in August, the Chicago Resettlers Committee was formed as a result of local Japanese American residents in Chicago with the assistance of an organization that still exists today called the Welfare Council of Metropolitan Chicago. Other groups that were involved with this included the American Friends Committee, the Chicago Church Federation, Hull House, the Immigrants Protective League, JCL, the Olivet Institute, the Women's International League, and both the YMCA and the YWCA. So there were a number of organizations, as many of us know, that found it within themselves to stand up and say, listen, this is wrong, we need to help people. So to kind of give you a visual of what the population looked like, this is a photograph from May 30th, 1946, in what is now the Conrad Hilton Hotel in Chicago. And there was a group back then that still exists. It's called the Chicago Japanese American Council. They had a testimonial banquet. And we kind of have looked at this. There's approximately 1,000 plus people in this photo, and almost all of them are Japanese Americans. And this is just to give you a visual of, from, again, 200 to 400 pre-war. By 1946, they're filling a room of 1,000 plus people, and that number, as far as residents goes, is increasing. We'll get this right. So the first office was located just north of downtown Chicago on LaSalle Street. A couple of our early executive directors, a gentleman named Porky Kawasaki and Jack Yasutake, were instrumental in the early days of creating this organization. Very quickly, the organization moved a little further north, as Lisa had indicated in some of her research. The population was slowly gravitating to the north side of the city. So the early mission of the organization was to encourage and help settlers become members of the Chicago community. They were tasked with helping them find housing, find new jobs, and rebuilding community. This was directly taken from a document from the CRC, and it is very aspirational, but it also, as you read the language, indicates the continuing efforts to prove oneself, the community's self, as being upright, standing citizens, believing in democracy, regardless of what just happened. But in putting their governance documents together, are talking about joining forces with all Americans, etc. So these are just, again, some imagery of the types of options that were available to all people coming out of the camp situations in the late 40s, mid 40s. We had the Chicago Nisei Hotel. There's another ad for, and that one is actually from the south side of Chicago. The middle photo is from a near north side establishment. And then we have just a photo of one of the community picnics that the Chicago Settlers Committee organized. And fortunately, the community continues to this day to have an all Japanese community picnic every summer. And so these are just some more images to show you some of the activities that the community, with the guidance of not only the Resettlers Committee, but the churches, the temples, to establish or build a new sense of home for these families. So then in October of 1954, the Resettlers Committee changes its name to the Japanese American Service Committee, or the JASC, which how we refer to it today. And it was done in recognition of the fact that it was no longer, or it was not as focused as much on resettlement as it was in terms of providing social services and community programs for the community. And these were just a number of the different types of activities that were being offered. So then, moving on into the 70s, the organization started to then recognize and focus on the aging of the population. And so services then shifted into social services, but also into actually building a structure, a 200-unit residential apartment building that is still in operation today. It's called the Heiwa Terrace. It was opened in 1980, and it operates under a separate corporation called the JASC Housing Corporation. And it was a monumental effort for our community to come together, recognizing that affordable housing for elders was very important. Shortly thereafter, the organization then embarked on developing what was referred to as the Cairo Extended Care Center. and it was a 180-bed skilled nursing care facility. However, in 1993, shortly after its opening, the organization needed to sell that facility to a private care provider, basically due to the fact that there was just a much higher financial burden on the organization to try to operate, a full service nursing care facility. So today, these are just some of the imageries of what the service committee is doing. If you do look at our website, you'll see that we are very active in helping services directed at seniors, adult day services, homemaker support services. We have a very popular program called the Out of the House program, and it's really focused on just getting seniors out of the house once a week to get some light exercise, socialize, have a meal, and really just sort of stay as independent as long as possible. We also have counseling services. We have a LCSW that helps families and individuals. We also do a number of cultural programs for the community, and we also have a bilingual, bicultural preschool program where it's not a drop-off. We have parents staying with the child. It's primarily focused and used by families that are bicultural. One parent is Japanese, the other is not, and the family places high value in having the children be exposed to the Japanese language, Japanese culture. It's been a very, very popular program. And then we also have recently re-implemented Japanese language classes for students. When I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, I was going to Saturday Japanese language class. Those programs over the last bunch of years have kind of disappeared, out of the temple schools. Primarily, I'm going to guess because the ability to find willing and experienced teachers to volunteer or basically volunteer to teach had diminished, and so the community was no longer able to support those programs. And so Service Committee has been working hard to try to reinvigorate a conversational Japanese language program for youth. The other component that the Service Committee is very active in is the Legacy Center, Archives, and Library. And being an organization that has been in the city for as long as it has been, we have been fortunate and blessed to receive materials from families that don't want to just pitch items. And so we have been actively gathering, cataloging, and archiving this type of information, and then sharing it with the larger community, both locally as well as nationally. We work with a number of other organizations that are doing the same sorts of efforts, and really getting this history of the incarceration experience as well as resettlement, out into sort of the mainstream. And these last couple of pictures actually are coming out of a scrapbook that a friend of mine whose mom just recently passed, and these are actually pictures from Rohwer, in Jerome, Arkansas. And so the one on the left is the fire department, evidently, and then the one on the right is the scenery from the camp. And let's see what else. And then we have camp near the woods on the left, and then a barrack scene on the right. My beautiful home, Takabo in front. These are just the inscriptions that were on the back of these black and white photographs. As Linda Harms Okazaki mentioned yesterday, there's so many stories out there, and it's really important to for all of us to do whatever it is that we can to kind of keep these things alive. Our organization, along with another organization in Chicago called the Chicago Japanese American Historical Society, are two organizations that are very intentionally and deliberately gathering and collecting and preserving this type of information so that people who are looking for photographs of, say, Jerome, Arkansas, can come to the service committee and get this kind of information out of our digital archives. And on the left here, we've been, for the last several years, doing what we have been naming all camp reunions. And Chicago being Chicago, as you've heard from Lisa and others, was a major either landing spot at the very least, or at the very least a pass-through point. And so I think it's safe to say that Chicago is probably one of the few metropolitan areas that can throw a camp program like this and have representatives from all of the different camps. And so we've continued to do this, and it's a great opportunity for just fellowship and gathering, and as we like to say, I know that the elders enjoy it because it's not a memorial service, it's not a funeral, and it gives them a chance to just sort of be together, very much like programs like these reunions and pilgrimages are for the community. And so that is what I had to say. And I will now pass it over to Jason. So thank you. Nope, I lied.
Hi everybody, thank you so much. I just want to start off by saying thanks to Mike and to Lisa. I'm not, I think I just kind of got fit in, and they allowed me to speak to all of you, so thanks to both of you. I think, so I want to talk a little bit about, so I'm the co-founder of a film company in Chicago, and we don't just do films about the Japanese American incarceration, but we do specifically only do films that are narrative. So what you saw this morning, which is a documentary, that's kind of how the film industry splits itself, right? So like there's documentary films that are historical, typically with interview driven, highly researched, and then there's the narrative film work, which most people can just think of as like Hollywood, right? So like X-Men and Spider-Man and Iron Man, a lot of men. And so, I want to talk today about what our role is, and I think each of us, through our different organizations, the next step that I see in terms of archiving things and social services are to then go out and to educate and to activate these archives that the JASC has, the JACL has, and actually all three of these organizations in Chicago, and I think a few others, are working on how do we use this story and how do we put this stuff together to go out into the world and educate people who are not our own community, right, while still respecting our own community. And I think, again, I'll mention Linda, I think she said, like, what do you do with this information? Write a story, make a film, go talk to your friends about it. I think that's what we're trying to do. And Full Spectrum Features, our medium happens to be film. So I got involved in film, I just kind of like literally fell into it, like just, 3 years ago I was working in finance and I had no idea I would be doing this and talking to people like at these kind of events, but I find that 3 years after I left my job, my life feels much more meaningful. And so a friend of mine came to me with a script, and he's a Korean American. He's like, I'm really interested in telling these stories about Americans. Like, he grew up in New Jersey. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. He's like, I'm really curious and interested in telling stories about Americans that essentially aren't white, right? Like that are never considered as Americans. Like, oh, hey, where are you from? I'm from New Jersey. No, but where are you really from? I'm really from New Jersey. Like I literally was born in New Jersey and I live in New Jersey. Like, what are you asking me, right? And or like oh, your English is so great. It's like, cool. So is my parents' English and my grandparents too. So he had this script about the Japanese American incarceration. And he was in Chicago and he was trying to produce it, but he didn't have any connection to the community there. So he was like, hey, would you be interested in helping me figure out how to, connect the community into this project? I was like, yeah, sure, great. So that's what the Orange Story was. And it started out as like a really small project. And we were like, what's the point of just making a film, and asking our parents to fund it? And like many other people, and then not having a plan for it to live in the world. And as we sat down and we talked about it a lot, we're like, that's a really silly idea. There's so much content out there. It's just we're gonna make this film. Narrative film is very hard. Any kind of film is very hard to make. Narrative film in particular is very expensive, very difficult to make. And so we sat down and we like locked ourselves in a room and we're like, all right, how can we figure out a better way to just not make this sit on our hard drives for the rest of our lives? And we said, well, here's one thing. What if we thought about how this kind of work could fit into the educational space? And so we wrote a grant into the Japanese American Confinement Sites grant, which I think many people get funding to do like really great projects like this. I know Mike Takata and JASC have a grant right now to do a very similar thing around education, which is amazing, and they're activating their archive. Lisa has, through the Build Your Legacy Fund, is also working on creating material and access. I'm not sure that's Jack's funding or not. A Concha project is. And so, we went out and we convinced them that we had this idea. We were the first narrative film to ever be funded by the Jack's grant. And what we did was very early in the process, we went out and we researched the story, but then we also put an academic advisory board together of the top scholars of this history to essentially vet everything, the script, the storyline, and then also to help us build this educational resource. So I'm just gonna really quickly, I think it's gonna autoplay, we'll see if it works. Oh, you can't hear it though. So this is just a quick clip of the film, and on the card you can go to the website. The film is free up there. So I'm going to skip this for right now, but it's essentially a narrative film, right? I'll let it play a little bit. The story is of a man who has to sell his store and essentially prepare to be forcibly removed from his community. And towards the end of it, there's a reason it's called The Orange Story. I'll leave it as a cliffhanger so you have to go watch it. But it's really short. It's 15 minutes long, and that's very purposeful. When we talk to teachers and educators, what they don't want is a 2.5-hour film that they're not going to show in their classrooms. What they do want is an 8 to 10 minute film. And so we sat down and we said, well, narrative film is really great for that, because what narrative film does, like scripted films do, is they emotionally attach you in a very short period of time to one character and one moment, right? So the project is that we are not trying to tell the entire story of World War II Japanese American incarceration in one single film. What we're trying to do is to take a room full of students who are not Japanese American, not Asian American even, and get them to really emotionally connect to what's happening on the screen, so that when they move into the educational experience, whether that's anybody that could be our educational experience, could be somebody else's, they'll understand the human emotion behind what's happening, and will care, hopefully, a little bit more to kind of like dig deeper. So this is real quick. Part of the problem is that, look, 10 DVDs over 34 hours, right? Like, what kid is gonna be like, yeah, I'm super excited to look through that, right?
Yeah.
Not super interesting, right? So like, we live in a digital age. We live in a world where, students are literally in the classroom staring at YouTube. So we're like, let's make something that appeals to them, right? So what we found as our solution was make a narrative film in order to build empathy among students, create a web experience, right? So pivot the students toward that engaging website, and then stuff it with primary sources and different documents and links to other resources, right? And then provide the educators, and this is huge, because I think a lot of times the information is all out there to teach us history. It's that educators don't know what the history is, and they're not going to walk into their classroom and teach something that they're not confident about, right? So you have to also think about them and provide them with the right information that's easily accessible. This just kind of quickly runs you to the website. There's all kinds of different things. I'll flip into this next one, I think is. So the key characteristics we were looking for was free access, consumable in one class period, modular, mobile ready, which means you can just like use it on your cell phone, and age and grade adaptable. So we've programmed this with third graders all the way through high school, or through college students actually. This just goes through kind of like, there's historical quotes, archival images, so oral histories, archival footage. So teachers like this because, like when you get really into the weeds of educational standards, there's all kinds of requirements around like, primary source documentation and media literacy. So all these kind of elements packaged into one place for that teacher is very helpful and makes their jobs hopefully a little bit easier. These are just what it looks like on the screen. So the other thing that we're really interested in doing is, like everything today is data driven, right? Everybody wants numbers and stuff. And so we care a lot about the actual impact on the human, but we're also always trying to get more funding and convince people that this kind of model is a good idea. So capturing statistics around the usage, like this is really interesting for us. The way that the Orange Story was built was 4 different chapters. And what you see right here is like, it's crystal clear that people aren't getting through to chapter 3 and 4. And chapter 4 is what we care about the most because it has this connection to contemporary relevance. So we just got the funding for 2 more of these, like 2 more films and 2 more educational websites. And this kind of data is going to inform how we build. We're not going to do the same thing. We're going to rebuild it in a completely different way so that we don't run into, or we hopefully don't run into the same problem, right? Oh, my sister's in the room. So Carly, she was doing a degree at the University of Minnesota. And so I'd like to just say that we work with this department at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at University of Minnesota. But it was really just Carly and I working together on this project for her thesis. But actually, this is something that a lot of our university partners and our funds are really interested in, because what we're saying here, right, is, okay, number of views, fairly shallow, like you don't really understand what quite's happening in terms of the impact of the tool. What Carly helped us do was to figure out how to start to measure the empathic response of a student, of an individual student. And this is through a whole bunch of data, different surveys, coding this data into all these different types of characteristics. And actually I didn't tell you this, but there were these 2 other U of M students who are now interested in picking this up and like extending it. And I think this is helpful for us too, because we don't just care about like getting it out there. Like what drives me to do this every day is like truly having a room full of 7th graders think a little bit harder about what their place in the world is and what their identity is, and then how that connects to history, how that connects to what they're doing today, and how that could connect to what they're doing tomorrow. This was a big for us too. So just earlier this year, we were awarded an honorable mention. And this was big because what we're doing is we're taking a narrative film, right? So historians like history, yeah? they like documentaries and they're very used to using documentaries. And so when we're presenting like, hey, why don't you use this narrative film that appeals to empathy? A lot of people are like, you know what, that's not a documentary, it's not history, you know? But this is like a 45-year-old organization. Public history is a very specific like subject or category within history where you're using history to engage the public, and that was big for us because it felt like it was like a kind of a stamp of approval on what we were doing and the model that we're building. So I mentioned a minute ago that we're onto these next two projects. Okay, 2 minutes. So we just got the funding again through the JAX grant for a new project called Resistance and Resettlement. There's going to be 2 more films kind of similarly in this model. Resistance is specifically around the draft resistance, and we're focusing in on Hart Mountain right now, but we want to broadly talk about resistance movements and what that means. I think Lisa made a great point earlier, like resistance looks like many different things. Even building your own community in Chicago is a form of resistance. And so I think this is going to be a great way for us to kind of talk about what resistance can look like, and start that off with draft resistance. And then the resettlement side of the story, I'm also super excited about this because I'm from Chicago and the Chicago community. We're going to do a film about Chicago resettlements, and you know, I think when I was watching Relocation to Arkansas today, those moments when, you know, there's a clear distinction just based on color of your skin, right? Like literally figuring out, where do Japanese Americans fit in? Are they white? Should they be using the white water fountain, or the colored water fountain? Should they be going to the white school or the black school? Chicago, just like the way that Lisa talked about it earlier, in terms of how Japanese Americans were buffer zones between white and black, Chicago, the story of resettlement has an amazing kind of opportunity and platform to really broaden out kind of the social and community impact around race. And in a place like Chicago that's still so segregated, I think it's going to be a really interesting kind of challenge for us to contextualize 75-year-old history, right, about what happened to Japanese Americans, and then how they resettled, and contextualize that into kind of the fabric of race that we understand and see today. So it's been really interesting. We've been doing a lot of interviews with Nisei and Sansei in Chicago with the director. The director's from LA. He flies into Chicago. We do a lot of these conversations. We should be taping them, but we don't. And the reason we don't is because people, they're much more open to sharing like more nuanced or like maybe like seedier, shadier things if they're not being taped. And we're trying to get to that emotional core of kind of what's happening and what they were thinking about. So here's a few things that have come up in our research. One is the strength of women in the resettlement period. They were, in a lot of ways, holding these families together. They were caretakers, they were working, and they were actually like, in a lot of places, kind of like the bedrock of the family. And so we're trying really, really hard to center the story that we tell, because so much of these stories and films about the incarceration are kind of male-driven. We're trying really hard to make the main character or the main protagonist a woman. We were talking a lot to the community about like, hey, what do you think about, you know, like the racial structure of what was happening during resettlement? People were like, we weren't thinking about that. We were just trying to survive. We were poor. We had nothing. It was a new city. Like, I wasn't thinking about like racial hierarchies and like, I don't know what you're talking about. I just needed to make money and actually put food on the table and survive every day. And that was really interesting for us. The centrality of social clubs. So, you know, I think Mike mentioned this, and the CRC, the Chicago Settlers Committee, had a lot of programs. There were a lot of like boys and girls and kind of like clubs. And then there was a really massive like sports club scene in Chicago that I think really helped to shape and build the community. So that was a big thing. Jobs and education, just the importance of education. Again, I think gender came into this in a big way where a lot of folks we talked to, or a lot of women we talked to said their brothers were the ones who were being pushed, to get higher education, and they had to work, and so that was also very interesting. But there was a huge importance put on jobs and education. And then I last put Clark and Division, where there was, I think Lisa mentioned this earlier, that was the kind of north side community where a lot of Japanese Americans lived, and there was also a lot of like pool halls and bars and gambling joints, and that really interesting stuff happening around Clark and Division Street. And that's what the community is telling us. What we're really interested in thinking about with the educational side is, this in-betweenness of Japanese Americans within the context of black and white, right? So what is the U.S. racial and ethnic hierarchies, and how does that work? How does that still play out today? And in a way, that's how we think we can extend this story out beyond our community and to really engage all kinds of different people when you start to understand from a system of oppression how the hierarchy fits in and how this story fits into that. So I just wanted to end real quick. So these are my grandparents. This is the connection to Rohwer, right? They met at Rohwer. My grandfather was from Stockton, California, and a few folks I actually talked to earlier or yesterday knew him. And my grandmother Kyo, she started out in Utah. Her father was a coal miner, and they ended up in Terminal Island, and then moved from there. And I just wrote this. So where do I sit? Okay, so this is very similar to what Richard Yada was talking about in the Relocation Arkansas film. I'm going to end this with just two quick quotes. This is a huge presentation no-no when you have like 1,000 words on one page. But I'll read it to you, don't worry. So this is from my grandfather that was actually interviewed by Mary Doy for the Regenerations Oral History Project. So my grandfather said, I got on the bus, and my first decision I had to make outside of camp was, where do I sit? The white people sat in the front of the bus, the blacks were in the back. And so I got on, and I thought, gee, I don't know where to sit. So I said, gee, we were confined so long, and we were discriminated so much, that maybe I'll be considered a black. So I went to the back, and I sat in the black area. The bus driver stopped the bus, and he says, hey, you gotta sit up in the front. So I got up and moved, but I didn't come way in the front either. I sat right by the dividing line. That's the first time I realized how much discrimination that the blacks had gone through. And it's really amazing. We were discriminated on the West Coast, but at least we were still able to sit in a bus wherever we felt like sitting. Our discrimination was very different, not as intense as theirs. That's the first time I realized that. So that's what we're trying to get after with our educational component, which is, contextualizing our history within the structural and the structural racism of the U.S. And then this is one final quote. This is from Charlotte Brooks from a paper called "In the Twilight Zone Between Black and White: Japanese American Resettlement in Chicago and Community in Chicago, 42 to 45." She writes, in helping the Nisei secure employment, the War Relocation Authority and church groups demonstrated both their assimilationist agenda and their willingness to uphold Chicago's racial traditions. WRA policies required resettlers to secure jobs before traveling east. While most firms hesitated to hire members of an unknown and apparently undesirable ethnic group, wealthy Chicagoans in need of servants proved more willing to accept the Nisei sight unseen. In addition, domestic jobs often included housing, which scattered Japanese Americans in wealthy neighborhoods where, in their status as servants, they would create little alarm. And by funneling resettlers into a sector of the economy that African Americans had dominated before the war, the agencies avoided stirring up resentment among white workers. So, I'm sorry, I think we're over by 5 minutes.
Thank you, guys. Let's give them another round of applause. Chicago contingent. Okay, so I know we're running a little behind, so we'll just take a very quick 2-minute break to switch over, 5-minute break to switch over to our next presenters. So if anybody needs to, before